AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
Hello, Gary.
John, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited about this show. You know, we're going to talk about the new UAW. That's what I'm calling it, the new UAW, and the labor revolution that's going on in this country. Because everywhere I go, everyone asks me, first question about the auto industry is there going to be a strike? And I know we've got a chance here to get into a lot of the details of what are going to go into these negotiations.
You know, before we start, speaking of that, it's sort of a coincidence. So last week, if you remember at the top of the show, you broke down the history of Chrysler, the Daimler Chrysler situation and beyond that. And I happened to discover today that on August 10th, 1978, Lee Iacocca sold Chrysler Europe to Citroën Peugeot for $1.
Yeah.
And
they got ripped off.
So I mean, just think about how you know, we're going to be talking about, you know, what has become Stellantis, because you know they're a big aspect of this, but you know, just to think about how, you know, industries are in a churn even as far back as 1978.
That's right. I remember that well. You know, GM and Ford had expanded a big time in Europe, and Chrysler decided it had to do the same thing, and it picked up some pretty poorly run companies. There was Rootes, Rootes, I believe, out of England, and Simca, if I remember, out of France. And they couldn't do anything. I mean, it was hopeless even before they bought it. Anyway, that's just for those who like to know some of the ancient details of this history.
Indeed.
So, hey, let's bring in our guests. We've got Marick Masters, professor of business and labor. I think I got that right at Wayne State University in Detroit. And we got Kalea Hall from the Detroit News, who's doing a lot of reporting on the UAW and labor. And did we lose Kalea? Oh, we did lose her. Okay, she'll be back here in a minute. I'm pretty sure. But Marick, wow! I mean, I call it the new UAW. This is not like the UAW of even just last year. Well, what do you make of all the changes going on?
Well, it's distinctly different in outlook, in philosophy, and it's also operating under a new set of demands as a result of the consent decree. It's under government monitorship, and that has a lot of implications for the behavior that you observe in terms of openness and transparency. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on the UAW leadership to be transparent with its members. There was a very close election for the presidency in which Sean Fain, the dissident representative, won by just a handful of votes. And he's trying to generate as much support among his constituency as he possibly can. And at the same time, put an umbrella over the UAW as a whole so that they're able to go into these negotiations with as much of a united front as possible. It's a challenge, but it really reminds me, in the prelude, you were talking a little bit about the history of the auto companies. Well, in the history of the UAW, there was a large communist and socialist influence in the UAW during its formative years. And that is reminiscent, I think, more of what you see today in terms of the militancy and the outlook that is a little bit less tolerant of business per se.
Well, Marick, speaking of history, so for our viewers that are not, you know, well versed in the UAW, could you sort of give us a sense of what they do and how we've gotten to today with that organization vis-a-vis the Detroit Three?
Let me give you a very, very brief sketch of their history, some high points. They were formed in the mid-1930s as a result of the Flint sit-down strikes. And they went through a very, very fractious period initially. But in the late 1940s, Walter Reuther solidified the leadership and began to rule the UAW as part of what is called the Administration Caucus. And he ruled it in the 1950s and 1960s until his untimely death in 1970. And during that time period, the UAW grew into a national powerhouse economically and politically. There were a series of strikes, which were usually targeted against companies such as GM in sequence with the bargaining agreements. But with international competition in the 1970s and the energy crisis, the membership in the UAW began to plummet as the auto companies' market share dropped, and they were peaked at 1.5 million. Today, they're at about 383,000 members, really a skeleton of their former selves, and about 65% of those members are in auto-related industries. They've had a history of being progressive, socially liberal, but this new faction is of a different ilk. It ejected after 70 years the Administration Caucus, which takes a lot, and it reflects the fact that you had the first direct election for UAW leadership in its history. And that allowed the rank and file to express its voice. And I think what you're seeing on the part of Shawn Fain today that's different from what it has been in the recent past, he's trying to stay more in tune with the membership. That's why he's giving Facebook Live presentations and perhaps being more vocal than we're used to.
Kalea, what do you make of it? I mean, you guys at the Detroit News, I bet you got your hands full trying to keep up with everything that's going on right now. And you know it's only going to get more intense as we get closer to the deadline of September 14 when the contract expires. So tell us about it. How are you guys all approaching it and everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a lot at once. I think all of us are a little bit concerned about that week of the September 14th timeframe because we have these contracts expiring, as well as General Motors has a subsidiary workforce that has a contract that expires the same day. Unifor has a contract that expires a few days later on the 18th. And we also have an auto show to top it off because why not? So, we are preparing as best we can. We're, constantly on the phone with sources to find out what's happening behind the scenes because, they are in committees negotiating, and we've seen that there have been demand sheets given to the automakers. One that was just recently thrown in the trash by President Shawn Fain, the Stellantis proposal specifically. So there you go. There it is. So I think all of us are preparing to work some overtime over the next few weeks coming up here. So
Marick, so as we're going into these contract negotiations, I mean, again, how are they conducted? I mean, what is it that Kalea and her team are trying to discern, and who are the members that go in and talk to the executives or management boards at the big three companies?
Well, let me say we're very fortunate to have reporters like Kalea and her colleagues at the Detroit News cover this because they're very good and they're very diligent and very well informed. And I learn a lot from my conversations with them. But typically what has happened is that the UAW, sometime in March of the year of the contract negotiations, will have a bargaining convention that will formulate their bargaining demands across industry. And the leadership will take that. It will meet with the bargaining committee in the respective companies, and it will formulate a plan to present to each of the companies. Prior to that time, the companies and the union have various degrees of information sharing that goes on. In some cases, they may even have joint training that goes on between their labor and management representatives to try and get everybody on as much of a collaborative a frame of mind as possible. And then they will start the contract negotiations. They kick off. They had these ritualistic ceremonies, handshake ceremonies, so to speak, that were jettisoned this year. The UAW opted for meet and greet at the plants, which I think was a wise move politically on their part. The last round of meetings in 2015 and 2019, I mean, they just really don't do anybody a whole lot of good in terms of getting ready for the negotiations. But then they begin to present their proposals. And usually that's been done in confidence, and they bargain. And at some point in time prior to the strike date, the UAW will pick a target. UAW this time has indicated that it may not pick a target, and I wouldn't be surprised very much if it didn't. In fact, I would be surprised if it did. And I think they're going to keep their options open. What's different about this time is, as you referenced before, Gary, the new leadership with a different tone. And also that means that the old thinking is gone and the new approaches to negotiations are very much different in terms of their accent. Now, when push comes to shove, they're still going to have to deal with the devil in the detail, and that will require skill on both sides. And you have to ask yourself, how experienced is the overall UAW team going into this negotiation compared to what they've had in the past? That's sort of an unknown question, but we'll find out soon.
You know, my concern, and I think this is probably what management is thinking about, is Sean Fain and his group are asking for everything in the kitchen sink. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a recognition that even amongst top executives in the industry that, yeah, UAW deserves big raises. But some of the other things just seem totally unrealistic to me. A 32-hour work week, which I see as a move to force the car companies to hire even more workers. I mean, if people are only working 4 days instead of 5 days a week, you're not going to be able to get the production out of them. This request for full defined benefit pensions, I can't see them going for that. Retiree healthcare, I thought that's what the VIBA was all about. And my concern is that to what you're saying there, Marick, is these guys are new to it. I'll bet you they're very good negotiators, but I wonder if they see the big picture. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, he keeps pointing out all the big profits that GM, Ford, and Stellantis are making, but in reality, GM and Ford are not very competitive on the global stage. They really aren't. Their profit margins are at the bottom of the list, really. And I'd just like to get, what your thoughts are. Do these union negotiators see what the big picture is?
Well, I think they see a big picture in terms of the labor movement and the desire for workers to get a higher share of profits and more generous wages. And they would like for them to be able to restore some of the benefits that they had in the past, the gold-plated benefits that they had, which very few workers now have. I think that you hit something, John, that is very important and that concerns me. And this reminds me a little bit of the situation with the professional air traffic controllers in 1981. When they went out on strike, although it's a different industry covered by a different law and strikes were illegal in the federal government and still are, you had a dissident group of leaders take over the union in a close election under the name of Mr. Poli, and they really refused to believe that they were dispensable, the air traffic controllers. And they went out on strike and they were fired summarily by Ronald Reagan. He did that on the South Lawn of the White House and said, basically, you have 24 hours to come back to work or you're going to lose your jobs. And he meant it. Ironically, the air traffic controllers were one of the few unions that endorsed Ronald Reagan running for president in 1980. What I worry about in this time is that you may have self-fulfilling expectations or prophecies, and that they get people so worked up and expect so much. I don't know if you've seen the recent numbers that I saw yesterday, that you probably have seen them in the press, that it's estimated that these contract proposals of the UAW would total about $8 billion and raise the costs to $150 an hour, $64 an hour at Ford, I think, in about the same amount at GM, and I think maybe a little bit under that at Chrysler. But I mean, Stellantis. Those are just simply unaffordable. And if they think they're going to get that, if they're going into the negotiations and they become intransigent, no matter what the membership says, then they're going to be very, very disappointed. And this is the concern that I have, is typically in the past, oftentimes leaders have been willing to modulate the demands of the rank and file and say, we understand you're mad and you're mad at the world and you want to get the world and you want to pay everybody back. But if you do that, you're going to really put yourself in the point where you're going to jump off the cliff, and that's suicide. Let's not do that. Let's try and be more realistic and get the best deal that we can. I don't know how much that modulating voice is present at the present time. I'm not saying it's not there, but if it's not there and the membership are really aggressive, and you're only hearing those members that want to speak to you. When you go on Facebook Live, there may be 1,000 to 4,000 members. That's not all the UAW, but that's what you're listening to. And the danger that some leaders have is they get into echo chambers and they start believing that everybody thinks the same thing those people are telling them. And I worry that there may be a miscalculation.
Marick, before we leave the PATCO subject, the air traffic controllers, so over 11,000 people lost their jobs as a result of that.
Wow.
And, which is a sizable percentage of the workforce that had existed at the time. Now, they were replaced, but do you see it conceivably that something like that could happen with the UAW?
I think that the possibility of that is remote. But what I could see happening is that if this negotiation were to produce business consequences that are unacceptable, that you would see companies thinking about moving out of North America and elsewhere. And that may, go back, GM and Ford, although they're nominally international companies, they've had to exit some of their foreign enterprises. And I think they are lagging behind globally in terms of electrification. And they may have to partner with somebody else in order to survive into the future. And obviously, Stellantis may have to think about doing the same thing. But I think you've got to keep all options open. And that means that the companies cannot make fiduciarily irresponsible decisions. And I think that's an important point we need to remember. These managers they have fiduciary responsibilities to their shareholders, and they just can't give everything away because they want a generous contract for the rank and file. No matter how much as I like to see everybody, I don't want to be an auto worker myself. I couldn't do that job. I don't begrudge people from a good living. But I think we have to deal with reality here, and that there are options, and companies can exit, they can move around, they can reorganize, restructure, and I wouldn't be surprised what might happen if they were stuck with contracts that they can't live with.
Kalea, what are you picking up when you do your reporting? What's your sense of the union leadership and, apropos of what Marick was just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, on the ground, it's interesting. I get a mix of answers from the workers in terms of what they think of the proposal. Like the big thing that came out last week was this 46. It was 40%, but really it's 46% wage increase over the life of the contract. That is the UAW's request to the companies. And some of them said, "Wow, that seems like pretty steep. Don't know if we're going to get that." Others said, "You know what? We need it. We deserve it. We gave up a lot during the bankruptcy." They did give up wage increases over several different contracts, and they want to see that return to them. But at the same time, I think a lot of them are realistic that there are some requests in there, like you were mentioning, the pensions and the retiree healthcare. I think they probably recognize that there's some things in there that they're not going to get. But they also say, shoot for the stars and see what you can get. Don't. And I think Sean Fain in ways knows that he has to go after as much as he can. I mean, look, we had a union leadership that was plagued with corruption for years, and the members in some cases don't trust the process. So I think that he has to come out with a firm request to, show that he isn't, we've moved past that. But yeah, I think that it will be very hard for them to get everything that they're seeking in their demands, for sure.
When you talk to these workers at the plants, what's your sense of their support for Sean? And here's the reason why I asked that. As you guys know, 86% of the union membership did not even bother to vote in the election.
Right.
Only 14% of the membership voted. And Sean Fain won by 50.1%. I mean, the smallest margin possible. Marick, you said it yourself, just a handful of votes. And so, to me, he doesn't necessarily have a mandate if you look at those numbers. But Kalea, what do you find? What sense of support do you find when you talk to the people at the plants?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many folks who just go to work, clock in, clock out, do their job. I think that Sean Fain making that move and going to the plants and doing those handshakes was a really good decision on his part. I think because I saw him taking people aside and talking to them. I don't know that workers ever really had that chance before, members did, to just have their president walk up to their plant and shake their hand as they're exiting work or going to work. So I think that shifted some opinions for sure. Our people didn't even know who he was, and he was just there. But of course, I mean, the admin caucus ruled for so long. There definitely still are folks who are like, not a fan. But a lot of the folks I talk to who, because the majority of them do just clock in and go out. They like it. They like what he's saying. They think, this whole record profits means record contracts. They love that. And they want to see all of these things that he's talking about. So I think the support is starting to really get amped up, and especially with the social media campaigns the UAW is doing, I think they're getting a lot more attention. It's a whole different strategy from the UAW's end. They're not. I don't think they're just trying to rally like their own members. They're trying to rally everybody in support of them. So
Marick, sticking with this handshake. So for people who don't read the Free Press or the Detroit News, they may not be familiar with the fact that at the beginning of these, give you a second there.
That's okay.
So at the beginning of no problem. So at the beginning of these negotiations, it would be the president of the UAW, Sean Fain, would shake hands with Bill Ford or Mary Barra or Jim Farley, or and pictures would be taken. And instead of doing that, as Kalea said, he was at the gates of factories and shaking the workers' hands. From the point of view of someone with a background in negotiation, as you said you are, what tone does that set for the negotiation?
Well, this is when I try and differentiate between what I consider to be noise and signal. The ceremonies were kind of nice. They brought in all the union representatives of their bargaining team with the leadership of the UAW, and they wore same colored golf shirts or whatever. And they sat across the room from the men and women dressed up a little more formally usually, and the leadership would shake hands in front of everybody. And it was a nice ceremonial introduction that they went through. And this time they decided to forego that. And you can read a lot of consternation into that. But I think what's really important is to what Kalea said is that they were trying to reach out to their membership and say, look, we want to hear your views. We're here to talk to you. Before we go into the negotiating table, we want to sit down, make certain we understand your views. And if we get an agreement, we're happy to shake hands with them. So what I think is the signal behind this, however, is they departed from past practice. Mm-hmm. And old thinking is gone. And when I look at that in a couple of different ways. They're looking at sharing profits differently. It's not just getting a profit sharing payment, it's getting profits plowed back into the workers' base. and other benefits that may be part of a fixed cost structure that the companies would have to deal with. And also it means departing from the usual practice recently of targeting a company, and if you strike, just striking that company like they did GM in 2019. I think now there's a distinct possibility they'll strike all three if they are to that point. And that's what I really look at and try to get my arms around. But to raise an issue that I think is really important in this understanding and Gary, you're right, from a negotiating strategy, both companies have to be thinking about this like a chess game almost. We move this way, they move that way. How do we try and influence their behavior by what we do? And it's important to realize that there are two parties to each of these negotiations. Now, obviously, public opinion is important, lawmakers' viewpoints are important, and other constituencies have relevance. But the company and the union sit down, but that means there are three concurrent negotiations taking place. There's one between the two parties, there's one on the management side within itself, and there's one on the labor side within itself. And I think in this particular negotiation, a set of negotiations, the labor negotiations are going to be as difficult within the union itself as those perhaps between the two. And it's important to remember that, as John pointed out, the election was close, and it was not only close in terms of the presidency, but the board is evenly divided. There are 14 people on the International Executive Board, which has the authority to determine whether or not you go out on strike. That split 7-7, and actually, if you prorate the members, the votes of each one of those officers, the dissident faction group, their 7 does not have a majority of the votes. It's a little short. And so I don't think it's a slam dunk that Sean Fain's going to walk in and just dictate what everybody's going to do. Yeah. And you've got people in the leadership team like Chuck Browning who've had a lot of experience, and they're at the forefront of the negotiations with Ford. And, you know, their voices are going to have to be heard too.
Mm-hmm. Wow, very interesting. You know, when you say you think that they could shut all three down, as you know, that'd be pretty easy. All you have to do is target key powertrain and stamping plants, you know, a handful at each company, and you bring them to their knees. They quickly run out of the parts they need to make anything. You can cripple them that way. Is that what you're thinking that they would do? And if you only target a few plants like that, those are the only workers on strike, technically. And so you preserve your strike fund because, as you know, everybody else is just going to file for unemployment.
Well, it would be very similar to what they did in 1998, in which they struck about 9,000 workers struck, but it brought production to a halt, I think, to a much broader number because of the saliency of the plants themselves. So I think that's an option. It doesn't mean that they have to strike all the company. They could strike parts of the company, critical parts of the company, or they could choose to strike corporate-wide in each of the cases. I think they're keeping all those options open, and I wouldn't be surprised if they did something just along those lines, John.
Mm-hmm. Hey, look, you know, this is probably a good time to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be back. There's a lot more topics I'd love to get into here.
How do Bridgestone tires stop shorter on what roads? It's their HydroTrack technology. But you don't have to know how the science works, just where the brake is. What really matters is their Bridgestone.
All right, we're back and talking about the UAW, the potential of a strike and all kinds of things. But Marick, let me come back to you. We really have in this country right now the tale of two Seans. There's Sean Fain at the UAW and Sean O'Brien at the Teamsters. And he just got whopping big raises. What, 45%, 46% raises for his members? Isn't that helping to set the tone of what's going on with the UAW negotiations?
Well, I think they are, and they've cited the Teamsters contract as being indicative of the kind of thing they'd like to emulate. And there are parallels between them in terms of their background. They both represent dissident factions. They overtook the dominant factions, and they have a new approach towards negotiating, which means that they're more open with their membership, and they're more open with the public, and they're more savvy about using social media. And so if I were advising the companies in this negotiation, I would say treat every conversation that you have with a UAW representative, wherever you have it, as if it's going to be reported on television that night.
Yeah.
And that there is no such thing as a closed door confidential conversation anymore. I think that you're going to see things. I mean, I've seen the Stellantis proposals. I'm certain Kalea has too, and they're pretty ambitious proposals. I mean, they weren't just thrown together, and drawn on the back sheet of a newspaper and sent to them. They are detailed. It's 30 pages of detailed proposals. And, when they talk about absenteeism, they cite data in there, and they say, we've had an absenteeism rate of 23% the past 2 years. And it cost us the production of 16,000 vehicles. It cost us to lose $212 million in possible revenue. So when they cite that, they're not just saying things that, this is just a minor issue we have to deal with. And they went down the list. There are lots of things in terms of healthcare, pensions that they want to, tweak with, change, and scheduling. They want to tie pay and profit sharing more towards reductions in absenteeism. And you may see some worker behavior dimensions negotiated into how you calculate profit sharing payments for individual workers going into the future.
So what would that mean? Give us an example of that.
Well, it would mean that you had to have a certain attendance record to get your payment, that you might forfeit some of that if you had a bad attendance record, or that they aggregate things and say that the workers' payments overall are tied to certain reductions in the absenteeism rate.
What you're saying is stunning. I hadn't seen that figure, over 20% absenteeism. I'm sure it varies from plant to plant, but that is far higher than I've heard. General Motors in the past has talked about 11, 12% at the bad plants. 20%, that means, 2 out of 10 workers just don't show up to work every day. That's I don't know how you can run a plant.
Well, it's pretty difficult. But I was watching something on television today, and they were showing the head of a company going through the offices of his business in the morning and noticing that nobody was there. And he said, well, how do we really run a business with nobody here? And they were talking about remote work and all that kind of thing. But I remember several years ago working with a company and its union, and we went to a meeting in Scottsdale, Arizona, which was a nice meeting at a golf resort, and the two sides met. And we had one of the vice presidents from the company come in and say, on any given day, 20% of our workers don't show up. And the union folks leaned back and I remember one senior guy said, you try working here for 30 years and see how much you want to show up for work.
Yeah, but I would say go take a look at Honda in Ohio. Go take a look at Toyota in Kentucky. They don't have unscheduled absenteeism. They have scheduled absenteeism, when you call in ahead and say, I got a doctor's appointment, I got to take the kids to this, or something's come up. Mm-hmm. And they'll tolerate a 3% scheduled absenteeism. And I said, well, what's your AWOL rate? And they said, what do you mean? I said, absent without leave. And they said, you mean unscheduled absenteeism? I said, yeah. And they said, you can't do that here.
Well, that's, those kinds of numbers suggest to me that you've got a management problem. Some of it lies with worker or lack of worker ethic, but some of it also lies with mismanagement of workers. It comes down in pivotal relationships between supervisors and workers. And I think also in terms of how they schedule and do things like that. Stellantis has these 12/7 schedules, which I think have created a lot of angst among workers. So
It's
when I see
12 hours a day, 7 days a week, right?
right, when I see things like this, when I see numbers like 23%, 20%, I want to go in there and say, what's the root cause of this?
Right.
And I'm agnostic about going into it. I just say, let the chips fall where they may. I'm willing to blame the workers. I'm willing to blame management. But finding a solution is what you have to do. And if you start pointing the finger and blaming each other, you're not going to get there.
Right. Great point. And that 12/7 thing, I'd be absent. You can only take that for so long. You just got to get a break.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like the same thing with nurses. I mean, when they have to work double shifts or something like that, it's pretty. I mean, I don't know how people can do it. I know that I couldn't do it. Call me a wimp, whatever. But I can work long hours, but I'm sitting at a desk writing. Now, to me, that's hard work, but I know that it's nowhere near the hard work that goes into working in an assembly plant.
Right.
Isn't that simply indicative that you would need more employees in order to have a more equitable working relationship?
I think that may be one of the points they're trying to make, is that they are short-staffed. When you have situations, there was a strike of the Service Employees International Union in Los Angeles the other day. It's called a general strike, but it cut across several public sector entities, from the airports, the docks, et cetera. And they were talking about work among custodians at LAX, the airport. And they were saying that they have substantially fewer custodians than they have in the past, and that they're overworked, and they really need more, but they can't find them. And right now, there are about 580,000 jobs open in manufacturing. And they're looking for people, and they're also looking for people to be truck drivers and lots of other kinds of jobs where people don't want to do that kind of work anymore, or they can't do it for as long as they were willing to do it in the past. And so as people have more options and they think of, work, life balance, those kinds of things, when I started work, not to talk about my age or anything like that, but when I started work, if I'd have told one of my first deans that I wanted a work-life balance, he would have said, and it would have been a he then, he would have said, that's a very easy decision for us to make. You can have all the leisure you want because you won't be working here anymore.
Wow.
And they used to walk around on Saturdays and see if we were there, Sundays even. You were supposed to be there cranking away. And those days are gone. But I think that, we have to reorient ourselves to a new workforce. And I think that's one of the things, Sean Fain was alluding to, maybe more of a European situation in which the average work week is maybe 36 hours, something like that. But take a look at all things and see how you can get, Gary, it's an excellent point. I mean, do you have enough people to get the job done? If you don't, then you maybe need to do something about that. But obviously that's costly.
Yeah, look, this is why, because people have asked me, would the Detroit 3 hire new workers if the UAW went on strike? I said, they can't get the people. In fact, this talk of starting at $16.50 an hour at the battery plants, like in Lordstown, Ohio, the market's going to take care of that. You can't hire people to go into a factory at $16.50 an hour. They're going to go work at Wendy's for the same money and have more flexible work hours.
Yeah, that's the reality. That and they say that the wage rate. When we talk about hourly wage costs for the auto workers, we typically include all the benefits in that compensation, which are pretty lucrative, relatively speaking. But the average hourly wage in the U.S. is about $33. And when you think about that, they were talking about UAW workers when they worked at GM under the old plant that's now the Ultium joint venture battery manufacturer in Lordstown, Ohio. They made $32 an So, I mean, I think that, people are saying that these are tough jobs, and that, the take-home pay that workers make is not as great as those hourly figures that are really the employer's cost, rather than the take-home pay that workers get, that they see. It creates some of the different perspectives that exist out there about compensation.
Well, why don't they think out of the box here? I mean, I'm looking at the figures right now. I got them written down. GM claims its employee healthcare costs, UAW healthcare costs, are $23,000 a year. Why not take those people, put them on Obamacare, have the government foot part of the bill? Maybe you buy some supplementary insurance so that you keep them at the same kind of levels right now that they've got, which, remember, no monthly premiums, no co-pays for anything for the vast majority of them. And you could probably save some money that way, take that money and put it in the paychecks of the workers, maybe even give the company a little bit of a break. Is anybody talking about thinking of clever and new ways of putting more money in the paycheck without driving hourly labor costs up higher?
Well, I think, interestingly enough, in 2015, if you recall, Dennis Williams floated a proposal that maybe the three companies ought to combine their health care programs, and that would give them more leverage in negotiating with the insurance companies so that they could bring down the costs, and with other providers. I think really what you're hitting, something that's critically important to this country. We spend more than any other country in the world on health care, but yet we don't have the best outcomes. And why is it that we have to pay so much to get health care? And I think we need to look at what are the principal drivers behind that and what we can do to bring about the reduction, because one of the major contentious issues over the past 2 decades or more in collective bargaining agreements has been healthcare, and it eats into the pay that people can take home. And so if you got to pay, if you have to pay retiree healthcare, if you have to pay active worker healthcare, and if you pay first dollar coverage, you're going to be paying a lot of money for each worker, and that's not money that they're going to be able to take home in wages. Something's got to give. And people have, struggled with this, and I don't think anybody's found a good solution to reduce the cost of healthcare, but we're going to have to do something about controlling that. I mean, we can't afford the exponential costs in Medicare, Medicaid, and healthcare in general in our society as we age more and as there are fewer workers paying into these programs that supplement or provide these kinds of benefits, particularly for retirees.
So, Marick, Kalea said earlier that the proposals the UAW are putting out there, like you ask for the stars and maybe you hope to get the moon. And I mean, so on the one hand, they're asking for reduced hours. On the other hand, they're asking for increased wages. There's got to be a balance there somewhere. I mean, how do you see this sorting itself out?
I think that they're going to be forced to make some difficult choices. Mm-hmm. And obviously not all their proposals can be considered equal in importance or realism. Some of them are pretty far-fetched, and you would have to be smoking something quite irregular in order for you to actually believe you're going to get those things. But that being said, I think if I were looking, peeling the onion a little bit, I think that they're trying to make a big ask so that they have a lot to trade off in the negotiations. And what they probably want, if I were looking at it from their perspective, I might be thinking along these lines. We know the companies are moving rapidly towards electrification. That means there are going to be fewer unionized jobs. That means that wages in certain parts of that sector are going to go down if we don't unionize them. So as long as the workers are there represented by us in the Detroit 3, let's get as much as we possibly can for them in terms of increases in their base. Because we're not quite so certain that electrification, we're going to be as profitable going into those. And therefore, our profit sharing payments may not be as big. And let's realize that in order for our workers to be well compensated and get a good sizable increase, we're going to have to ask for a large increase in the base. And also we're going to have to ask for COLA, but we might not get COLA, but we may get larger performance bonuses annually or other things. I noticed something very interesting between 2015 and 2019. Ford gave to each hourly worker on average $54,000 in payments in profit sharing and bonuses. And in 2022, across the three companies, the total amount of profit sharing given was larger than $36,000, $14,000 at Stellantis, $12,000 at General Motors, and about $9,000 at Ford. So, I mean, if you think creatively outside of the box in terms of how do you come to a compensation number, and if some of that goes into the base, if some of that goes into increased profit sharing or whatever, and you tie profit sharing to improve performance on absenteeism, and you make operational improvements that are going to reduce your costs, that may be an area where you can trade things off. I would hope that the union would be recognizing that nobody benefits from absenteeism and that it only ends up costing the company and the worker. And that also they've got to be realistic and understand that the companies have huge demands on the resources to compete, and nothing is certain. The threats they face in this environment are existential.
Yeah.
From the standpoint of the global competition, existential?
Well, I think it is the global competition that makes it as existential. I think you've got, so many, China looming so greatly and largely in this domain, India, and other companies with, other countries with that are more endowed with relevant natural resources and have greater populations to base their domestic markets on. That all those things to me suggest that, if you're relying increasingly on the United States, given our anemic growth rates and otherwise capability of managing the economy, I think that we're going to be hard pressed going into the future.
Yeah, I think there's some other things to consider here too. As you drive up labor rates, there's always a make-buy switch between labor and automation. The more you raise the cost of labor, the more attractive automation starts to look. And the one thing that I'm not sure that the union is aware of or doesn't want to pay attention to is earlier this year, Tesla announced a new assembly process that it's going to introduce at an assembly plant in Mexico that revolutionizes the assembly line. In fact, there is no assembly line. Everything is built up in modules, and then kablunk, it all comes together at one point. So there's no moving assembly line. That'll throw half the people out of every assembly plant. And if Tesla is successful with this, and I'll bet they are, every automaker in the world is going to be forced to follow suit. And so earlier in the show, I asked, is the union aware of the big picture? Because I think these things are a big threat to it, and I'm not sure that they're paying attention.
Well, with the advances in automation, all different kinds of automation, I think that that's a really good point that you just made, and that companies will look for alternatives as labor becomes more expensive. This is across industries. You see it in the strike involving the screen actors. You see it in the strike involving the writers. They're concerned about artificial intelligence. You can see it in a number of different other industries in which people are saying, look, we can redesign the assembly process. We can redesign manufacturing, make it less worker dependent. And across the board, I would be, if I were to forecast anything, I would say in 10 years, you will be lucky to find a waiter in a restaurant. Now we don't have any gas station attendants. I think the last state to really eliminate that to some extent was not required anymore was New Jersey. It just did that this week, I think. And so I thought that was very interesting. I didn't even know there was a state that still required you have gas station attendants. But you think about this. When was the last time you spoke to a telephone operator?
Never.
When was the last time you spoke to a real person? And so that may be a long time going forward. But I think the point is very well taken. And Tesla is the competition that they're looking at. Tesla, according to numbers I've seen, pays $45 to $50 an hour.
Yes.
And the transplants pay about 55.
Mm-hmm.
Ford pays 64. And so, I mean, if you're talking about kicking that price up to 100 or 120 or 90 or 80, you're really putting these companies in jeopardy and workers in jeopardy because people will make choices. They will relocate, they will modernize, they will substitute technology, they will do anything to avoid having to pay those costs because they know it's just you can't operate the business in that model.
But I do think that Sean Fain knows these things. I'm certain he's aware of. I mean, they've been automating the process for years, so I think he is aware of these things, and I know he's aware that he has not organized, the UAW has not organized the transplants, and I really think maybe after these negotiations, if they're able to win major gains, that we'll see them try to do that again, because that will help them. I don't know. Maybe Marick could talk more about that, but I think if they do get major gains, that could open them back up to going back to Toyota, Honda, VW, and saying, "Hey, what do you guys?"
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make, Kaylee. That another thing the UAW is looking at is that when they try and sell themselves to the transplant workers or the workers at Tesla and Rivian, they've got to have something to sell.
Right.
And higher wages are a thing that most people can resonate with, and better working conditions, safer. I don't think it's by, accident they released this report on Altium talking about the hazardous working conditions at the plant so soon before these negotiations.
But they've never done that, Marick, and which puzzles me greatly. The UAW, and I swear it's in all of their transplant negotiating efforts, have turned it into a social justice issue. And they bring in social justice leaders from around the country. And I don't think that resonates with people on the line. I think what you're saying is show me the money. Show me how you can put more money in my pocket. And now I'm interested. And I'm blown away that they haven't been able to organize.
I think you're right. I think they're not only has the UAW suffered from the scandal and the image problems associated with that, it's suffered from just having a bad style of organizing that I think has reflected the heavy-handedness of the administration caucus. And the international, I mean, you talk to UAW members, rank and file people in the regions and locals, they'll say the last place they want to go to help is the international. They don't like talking to the international. They don't trust the international any more than they trust the companies. And so therefore, I think, the more and more they get off on what I would call important, but yet not basic bread and butter issues, the more difficult they're going to find it trying to get people to support them. Because people, when they have to vote for a union or take an effort to create a union in the workplace, they are taking a decided risk. And it's not only a risk that they may be retaliated against by their employer while they try and support a union, but also a risk that if the union comes in and represents them, then it's got to get the first contract, if they're not folded under a master agreement, or that they've got to, if they're stuck with unacceptable working conditions, then, companies will look for alternative options about where they want to do business.
Hey, look, we're getting close to the close of the show, but we still got one thing I want to get into with all three of you, really. And Marick, I'm going to start with you. What do you think? They're going to be a strike? We're literally just some weeks away before we're going to know for sure. What's your sense of it?
Well, if you'd asked me before a recent Facebook Live presentation, I would have said that we're likely to avoid one. Now I'm not quite so certain. Mm-hmm. But there is a I will say this, there is a path for the parties to get a lot of what they want, to come to a mutually satisfactory agreement without jeopardizing their futures. And I hope they have the wisdom to see that. And I agree with Kalea. I think Shawn Fain knows these realities. He's just got a difficult job managing his own union at the present time, and he's got to really thread the needle. And it's going to be a Herculean task for him.
Mm-hmm. Kalea, what do you think? Strike or no strike?
Be surprising if there wasn't some sort of work stoppage, and I don't know what it looks like. Like Marick mentioned, we don't really know if we could have a lead company. It could be something else. It could be all three at the same time. We just keep going, and then they strike one or they strike both. I don't know. It's a whole new set of rules now with the new leadership in place. So, but I do think there will be something, some sort of work stoppage. Yes.
Yeah. Gary, what do you think?
Well, I would agree with Marick. Having watched the same Facebook Live, I would be surprised if there isn't. I'm not sure how long it would last, but it just seems to me that when you have a list that's like this long, I don't think people can see this of the demands. That even if you pare them back, it's still a big lift, and to be able to achieve those in the short period of time between now and when the contract expires, I just don't know how they're going to do it. And that, Shawn Fain needs to save face. The executives at the OEMs need to save face. And man, that's got to be a tough job. What about you, John?
Well, I'm positive there's going to be a strike. Hopefully they'll prove me wrong, but I'll tell you why. And I said this as soon as Shawn Fain was elected. He didn't have to throw the Stellantis contract in the trash for me to think, there's going to be a strike. And here's why. He barely won, as we said. 50.1% is the margin that he won it by. He's got a very small base. They're very agitated. They're hardcore. They want to take the companies to the mat. If there's not a strike, those people are going to say, John, you weren't tough enough. You could have got more. And so I think there has to be a strike just for his own political reasons. Now, if it's a couple of weeks long, that's manageable. If it goes on for months, that's going to be a real problem. And if Marick's right and they take all three of the companies down, now it's a real big problem. Because, and this is when I talk about the big picture, another thing on the sidelines, there's a lot of very small tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers here in the United States, especially in the Michigan area, that are in deep financial trouble even before the strike comes. They've just gone through 3 years of devastation where volume fell, and the automakers raised their prices, and the car dealers raised their prices, and suppliers barely were able to raise their prices. And there's a lot of these small tier suppliers whose total business is not just with one company. It's often on one program. I make the X component for the F-150. Right. And if that thing shuts down, I'm toast. And with interest rates where they're at right now, these guys can't borrow money to keep operations going. They can't afford it. And so that's why I'm saying if this thing goes on for more than a couple of months, the big losers are not just going to be the Detroit 3 and their suppliers and their dealers. The union's going to lose as well, because the transplants, the foreign automakers will absolutely take advantage of it and gain more market share.
All right. So you're leaving one aspect out here, John, and I'd like Marick to comment on this. That would throw the proverbial historic wooden shoe into the works, shut things down, and Bidenomics would be in bad shape if that were to happen. Is it possible that the President of the United States would step in?
I think it's distinctly possible. If you had a strike that would look like it was going to be prolonged and the ripple effects that John talked about, I think that they've already appointed a go-to person. I don't think that was just because they wanted to make headlines in the newspapers. I think it was because they intend on playing a role. And they will be a part of the negotiations. And I don't think it's accidental that Sean Fain met with the president a few weeks ago in Washington to sit down and just have a nice chat. I think that they are a very interventionist-oriented kind of an administration, and they realize that their handling of the economy is one of the weak points that they have, and so therefore they're worried about inflationary pressures, and they're worried about anything that might throw the economy into a recession. They're going to be watching this with a keen eye.
Real good. On that note, we're going to wrap it up, and I want you guys to come back on the show after this is all over, or maybe in the middle of it, because we know about a month from now, as we tape this show, it's going to be spectacular. Hopefully, a good happy ending, but as you guys just heard from me, I don't think it's going to go that way.
Well, I hope that you're wrong, but I'm not betting that you are.
Yeah.
I think that there's a distinct chance, and so we'll just keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah, real good. Kaylee, thanks so much. Marick, thanks so much.
Guys.
Thank you.
And
Thank
Gary,
you for
always great to be with you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
AutoLine After Hours is brought to you by Bridgestone Tires, solutions for your journey, and by Borg Warner.
If you like this program and would like to learn more about the automotive industry, check out our website at autoline.tv or look for us on YouTube on the AutoLine channel.